What's going on, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Book Binge on the King Crusoe YouTube channel. This week is episode 33, and we're doing the 7th of my Dark Tower reviews covering book 6 of the series, Song of Susannah. I love the purples. Why is purple my favorite color? Can you tell that it's my favorite color? But I love this cover. Like I said, this is the 7th of 8 total reviews going to be coming out for the series, and then I'll do a full series ranking and review of the Dark Tower, maybe at some point in October. I don't know. It might take me a little bit to kind of get that video organized, but this was definitely the slowest that I read one of these books. Over 3 weeks. It took me over 3 weeks to read just 385 pages of the book, not counting the coda. About 2 of those weeks, I had absolutely no reading done at all, which you can check out the kind of mid-year update video that I did near the end of June, because I caught COVID, all that stuff. I don't need to go into that in this video, but I have some thoughts about this book, and that's not surprising given that I think pretty much everybody who's read the series has a couple of thoughts about this book, and I'm pretty sure it is cited as the worst in the series by most people, but let's just kind of go into the good and the bad. But let me just comment before we go into this. This is the 5th video in a row that I've recorded today, so my voice might be a little bit scratchy, but I completely forgot that I didn't get the best elements and worst elements in my notes done yesterday. So I'm going to be doing this one a little bit more freeform. Now, I could just finish the notes and record this one later, but I'm in the groove, recorded a lot, and I still feel good, so I wanted to cover the video anyway. So this one might be a little bit less structured than the last several Dark Tower reviews, which I'm very happy with how they turned out in terms of recording. However, let's just go into what are some of the best elements of Song of Susannah. First things first, I really enjoyed how the book really continued right off the bat, starting right at where Wolves of the Kala left off. Now, this is something that the series has done quite frequently. Between most of the books, it's rather immediate between when each installment happens. The only time where there's a real large gap, at least so far as I'm aware, because I haven't read the last book yet, the only books that have a real gap in between them is books 4 and 5, which is kind of why Wind Through the Keyhole exists between those books, because it's the only place that it really had a chance to exist. But I did really like the way that this started off basically right at the very end of Wolves of the Kala, even though this as a book couldn't have existed at the end of Wolves of the Kala as a whole. And this is something that I'll get into at the very end of the video. I'll actually just go ahead and note it right now so I don't forget. Now that I've written that note down, I actually don't remember if I even finished the complete thought that I was saying before, and I don't remember what thought I was trying to make, so sorry if that just kind of was left incomplete. Something that I really enjoyed about this book was the way that it delved into some of the characters' personalities under a specific type of stress. Most particularly, this was affected with Eddie, but you can even kind of see how it affects like Jake and Callahan, which I can say his name because, like I said in the Wizard and Glass review, if you haven't read through Wolves of the Kala and you're watching this review, I don't know what you're doing. Either way, but you also see a lot of character work with Eddie. So you see kind of the way that some of these people, these characters really interpret and go through this situation that's really stressful for them because there's some crazy stuff that happens with Susannah and Mia, and Susannah's baby as foreshadowed from the Wastelands. Like, there's a lot of stuff that happens in this book regarding Susannah primarily. It's kind of why she's the title character, I guess. But there's a lot of character work that is done throughout the book with Eddie specifically that is incredible to see. You know, there are moments where you kind of see some of these gunslingers that aren't Roland get their I'm a real gunslinger now moment, and you sort of feel that way at the beginning of Wizard and Glass when Eddie's able to defeat Blaine by telling silly jokes instead of serious riddles, but that's just kind of like Eddie getting his comeuppance from, you know, recovering from being a heroin addict, basically, in book 2. I would say in this book, Eddie actually becomes a gunslinger. You also see some pretty serious, not necessarily emotional, but emotional for the characters, moment that happens with Jake near the end of the book that I thought was really cool in this regard, where it's like, oh, well, maybe Jake isn't a true gunslinger yet, which you can kind of empathize for because obviously he's still a kid in the series. So you can kind of feel some of that. It's part of why Wizard and Glass worked so well with Roland telling his backstory. He was still a kid. He wasn't a true gunslinger yet then either. It was kind of cool to see some of these parallels and how some of these things are called back to and utilized in this book. Something else that I liked about Song of Susannah, quite frankly, was the structure. I mean, it's obviously called Song of Susannah, so the chapters, the parts of this book are called stanzas. I thought that that was a really interesting way to organize the book. 13 stanzas and having them each kind of cover one particular character or a set of characters depending on what's happening. And I would say the overall pacing of the book for the first like 3/4 or even like 4/5 of the book is really good. I wasn't a very big fan of the end. Like the last stanza, I did not really like at all. And most of the stanzas with Susannah were meh, but we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I just thought that this structure and idea, I guess, for the whole book worked rather well, even though it's kind of like a gimmick in a way. And at the end of each stanza, there's a couple of stanzas of like a type of poetry. They get rather repetitive, but just being at the end of the stanza, it's fine. It's not like the whole book's written in verse or anything like that. That would be pretty weird, but not that this book doesn't get weird. Anyway, I just think that there's a lot to like about this book, but overall, I would say that it's not necessarily outweighed by what there is to not like, but there are some other issues with it. Although before we go into that section, I just remembered some of the meta stuff that happens in Wolves of the Kala. If you predict what's going to happen in this book with some of that correctly, there's a moment, a scene, a stanza. Can't remember which stanza it is off the top of my head actually anymore. I can look real quick here at the beginning. Let's see. Yes, stanza 11 of this book has a scene that I loved. Stanza 11 of this book is one of the highlights of the series because it's not necessarily out of pocket or coming out of nowhere, but the way that it was handled I just thought was really good. I'm not going to go into spoilers obviously, but the fact that I've talked about some of the meta stuff from Wolves of the Kala in context of this, you might have an idea of what's happening. I thought that this was really cool. I loved this, and am really excited to see how it's utilized in the next book because there are some things that are like, that's got to be used a little bit more. But basically, what I'm trying to say is, I loved stanza 11. That stanza in and of itself is really good. Basically, everything of Eddie and Roland in this book is really good. The stuff with Jake and Callahan is pretty good. Susannah's a little bit more mediocre. And now that I've kind of gone over this stuff, I will go into some of the worst elements of the book. It gets really weird in a couple places, mostly the Susannah stuff. I mean, the meta stuff is pretty weird, but it's not like the Dark Tower kind of weird, you know? It's just, there are some moments with Susannah because obviously in book 2 of the series, Susannah was Detta Holmes or Odetta Holmes and Detta Walker, and then those two kind of combine to become Susannah Dean at the end of the book, at the beginning of book 3, and then Susannah is just Susannah, and occasionally Detta pops out, just kind of as a personality. This book really leans heavily into the idea of Susannah being split, but takes that idea in a completely different direction than I was expecting, and that I think worked for me. I mean, it's not necessarily that I didn't dislike this stuff or dislike these sections, but overall, I would say throughout the whole series, if you asked me which my least favorite character was, I would say it's probably Susannah, and I didn't really like the Detta slash Odetta stuff in book 2 either. Like that first chapter of that section in Drawing of the Three, I just did not like at all. So there's some problems that I have with that. The fact that this book is mostly about Susannah and it handles some of that division, especially the pregnancy, it goes into really weird places. Like, if I can just say the Dogan, or the Dogan, I don't know how it's pronounced, the kind of place that Susannah retreats to that's just kind of like the inner mind. It's kind of like a physical setting for the inner mind. It's really weird, like I said. When this just kind of popped out and it becomes a setting a couple different times in the book, it is super, super strange. And I don't know if I liked those ideas. Most of the weird things in this series that happen, I don't necessarily have too many complaints about. It's like, oh yeah, that's weird because King was on cocaine when he wrote some of these books. But this book goes into really weird places that I don't know if they're deserved or justified, I guess. It's kind of hard to explain, especially without trying to go into spoilers. I hope that The Dark Tower, the last book, doesn't deal with some of these weird stuff in as explicit and weird a manner as this book did, because it's just kind of weird. And like I said earlier, when I stopped and paused to take a note, there's a really weird thing that happens with the pacing. And I also commented that I wasn't a very big fan of the final stanza. This is because Song of Susannah just it suffers from that middle book syndrome that trilogies often have, where the first book is a really good, self-contained story that exists as the start of an epic journey. The last book is an epic finale, but then the second book just doesn't know what it's doing and just kind of exists. The way that Wolves of the Kala, Song of Susannah, and The Dark Tower are written, even though I haven't read the final book yet, it Song of Susannah very much feels like it suffers from this kind of syndrome to me because Wolves of the Kala existed as its own book. Song of Susannah mostly feels like it could, but then there's just no end. Where it stops, it's just like it's not even like it's a similar problem to what happens in the Wastelands, because the Wastelands just ends right in the middle of the climax. This book ends right before the climax. Like there's just it ends in a really weird spot is what I'm trying to convey here. Because without going into spoilers, what happens at the end of stanza 12, which is the second to last stanza in the book, it's like, okay, this is going to happen soon. But then stanza 13 switches to another one of Susannah's viewpoints and goes through some of the stuff there. And then that ends with another, like, oh, this has more to happen. And those two are the way that both stanzas 12 and 13 end is like, okay, those are two things coming together. There's something big that's supposed to happen, which obviously I presume is going to be where book 7 of the series starts off. And I keep looking over here because I have the book on my desk because I'm starting it here in probably a week or so. Maybe less than a week, I don't know. It's just, it feels really weird because Song of Susannah doesn't feel like it ends. There's some weird pacing issues with just the way that it feels. It's so short and it just kind of exists in between these big books that are Wolves of the Kala and The Dark Tower. Based on what I know, it would be really weird or impossible and wouldn't make sense for Song of Susannah to be part of Wolves of the Kala because Wolves of the Kala existed in and of itself as its own story in a way that I think worked well. And obviously, I haven't read The Dark Tower yet, but I presume that it kind of feels the same way, and that's why Song of Susannah exists as it does. But it's definitely missing something to make it feel like a complete entry by itself. There's just a problem with that. And I mentioned this in the best part elements of the series because I don't really have this organized very well. But yeah, Susannah's parts to me are rather just mediocre. All the stuff with the other characters I liked pretty well, including a couple of the stanzas that I thought were really good. But most of Susannah's stuff just goes really weird and does really weird stuff with a character that I care the least about in terms of the whole quartet. And I don't know, I just wasn't a huge fan of this book in comparison to the others. I still gave it 3 stars, but and I even would have been willing to give it 4 stars, and it just would have been like this is a very low 4-star book, if not for the way that stanzas 12 and 13 ended. Just the fact that they stopped right before this huge climactic moment is supposed to happen, and it just doesn't occur. So, yeah, I was like, I might be willing to give this 4 stars because I'm not disliking it. There's some weird stuff, but that's fine. But then it just ended, and it's like, eh. The book feels rather incomplete because of that. So, I'm really excited to go into The Dark Tower because I want to see where the series ends, and I want to see what happens in the final book, given how this book happens. But I mean, at least luckily for people who read the series as it was being released, they didn't have to experience the whole Wastelands Wizard of Glass thing because that was several years in between those books, but these ones there was basically no time at all, luckily. So I'm excited to go into the next book and kind of see how things go from there. But yeah, this was definitely the most mediocre of the series. Like I said in the went through the keyhole review, I was like, this might still be my least favorite in the series, but I enjoyed it a lot more than I expected. But after thinking about it a little bit, and especially going over some of the things that I don't like about this book and rating it on Goodreads and whatnot, I was like, yeah, no, this is my least favorite of the series. Honestly, by a fairly substantial amount. Just just because it feels so middle book syndrome-y, I guess. So that's the end of this video. I'm curious to know what kind of your thoughts are on this book. Are there things about the weirdness or even the meta-ness, stuff like that, that you liked, hated? What did you think about the book? I haven't been asking this question basically in any of my reviews ever, but I really want to know in regard to Song of Susannah because it's just kind of an off the wall, not off the wall. It's just it's a pretty loony book. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about it. So comment down below and let me know, and then subscribe and make sure you're checking out the Dark Tower review that it might be coming out next week. I'm not 100% sure. Might be a couple weeks from now. We will see. But I will have the review for the final book in the series sometime this month in September. So be sure to subscribe and check that out when it's ready. Check out seasonalproductions.com for all of my YouTube and writing content all in one place. And like I said, I'll be back next week with a review of something. It might be the final book in the series, it might be something else. So just have to kind of figure it out. So thank you guys for watching. I really appreciate any and all support you guys show to the channel, especially the regular viewers who give me, several views and several average watch minutes for basically every video, almost no matter what it is. So I really appreciate you guys. I'll be back again next week.